あ、始めようぜ。
どこを見ておる。
俺に力を貸してくれ。天差残月。これが俺の挽回だ。
Bleach Rebirth of Souls.
Bleach Rebirth of Souls was announced a few months ago, but I've been holding off on making a video until I saw a full match so I could get a better idea of how the game actually plays. I don't know if it was just me, but I couldn't exactly understand what they were going for with the character trailers and, ironically, the gameplay demonstration, which left me more confused than anything. But now that we have over 20 minutes of uninterrupted footage, I think I've got a pretty good idea of what we're in for, and while it looks mostly amazing, there might be a problem that'll become more obvious over time. But before I get into it, let me start by saying that I love Bleach. Not the refreshing beverage, the show about the ghost samurai and their war against the Spanish. It's a series I've been into since the mid-2000s, along with Naruto and the whole anime boom around that time. But when it comes to Bleach games, I'm sure I'm not the only one who has been disappointed that we haven't gotten something at the level of a Naruto Storm or Dragon Ball Sparking for the last 10 plus years. And besides replaying Soul Resurrection for an upcoming video and spending way too much money on Brave Souls, I've even gone back to J-Stars and Jump Force just to fill that strawberry-shaped hole in my gaming library. So if I say anything you disagree with, that's fine, but it's coming from a longtime fan who wants the best for the series and not a tourist jumping onto the Blood War hype train. And with that said, here are my thoughts about the game. Presentation-wise, Bleach Rebirth of Souls looks and sounds great. From what we've seen so far, there seems to be a pretty big budget behind the project, which is more than you can say for most anime games. It'll be coming with a story mode that covers the events from the beginning of the series up until the end of the fake Karakura Town arc. That's about half of the entire manga, so it's pretty ambitious for a first game. It seems like we'll also see story-exclusive bosses like Fishbone as well. Seeing how long the story mode is going to be, and getting confirmation that a character like Matsumoto will be playable, makes me think that the roster will be bigger than expected. Speaking of characters, from the ones we've seen so far, they look mostly on point and their animations are clean. But I did notice a few frames where... yeah. But we don't even have a release date, so I'm sure they'll get fixed. I like what they did with the environments. They're full of detail and have very cinematic lighting, but despite this, attacks are still readable and you don't get lost in the noise. Stage transitions are also making a comeback. The last anime fighter that I can think of that had them was Jump Force, so it's good to see Ichigo isn't leaving that dumpster fire empty-handed. I personally don't think that the game could have looked much better than what we're getting, especially for the first console title in 13 years. The dev team mentioned that the visuals were inspired by the updated color grading of the 1000-year Blood War anime, which uses more manga-accurate palettes and designs. And while it works really well, I wouldn't be against an option to make the game look more like the original series. The pale Blu-ray arts contrasted well with Ichigo's orange hair and was always very cool to see. This is something that I referenced for this video's thumbnail. I just think it looks good. But when it comes to sound design, I think that the team did an even better job here than with the visuals. Because while there are some weirdly off-model shots here and there, especially noticeable in Ichigo, everything on the audio side feels very polished. The game has already settled on a great level of impact and punchiness for every hit and effect, which is something that Sparking Zero was struggling with until more recently. Even simple sounds like footsteps and how Ichigo readies Zangetsu has a high quality feel to them. Pair that with the unique character themes that cut in when someone powers up and...
So good.
I especially like Yoruichi's theme. These themes hit pretty hard and gives the player a good idea of the characters' personalities. They sound like something we'd hear out of Guilty Gear Strive or even Marvel vs. Capcom, and helps this game stand out from others that feature soundtracks which just kind of vaguely resemble something from their shows. But even after all this praise, I do have one criticism about the audio, and it's the announcer. But I'm sure I'll get used to it. I hope. Originally, I was worried that the flashiness of the UI would be distracting, but seeing it all in action, it blends surprisingly well with the gameplay, and the aesthetic just feels very Bleach. I can't think of many other series that have the stylistic flair that Bleach does, and while we got bits and pieces of it in games like Brave Souls, it's nice to see it being taken full advantage of here. Alright, let's move on to the gameplay, and apologies in advance if this is a little dense, there's a lot to go through. From what I can tell, it doesn't look like Rebirth of Souls is a typical arena fighter. There's less focus on the arena side of things like you would see in most other titles, where traversing the environment is a key aspect of the gameplay. Instead, combat here seems more focused on the offensive, and movement looks more like a Soul Calibur or Tekken style fighter, with 8-way movement instead of being fully free like in Storm for example. Characters don't face away from the opponent and are always locked on, which is either a good or bad thing depending on preference. I personally think this is pretty refreshing and it gives me hope for a more balanced experience. You can see some sidestepping, some poking here and there, and it doesn't seem like you can charge your meter by holding a button, so you have to earn your specials by attacking. It's possible that the devs look to the Heat the Soul games on the PSP for some inspiration, at least for the 8-way movement. I should mention that while the developers of Rebirth of Souls, Tamsoft, do have experience with making competitively viable fighting games, they're also responsible for series like Senran Kagura and Hyperdimension Neptunia, which are more button mashy. But at least judging by Bleach's gameplay, there looks like there is some depth and balance here. Next up, this is what I could figure out about the game's basic controls and mechanics. You have a light attack string, a heavy attack, and a signature move. It looks like if you mash light, it'll lead into a heavy attack similar to something like Dragon Ball Fighter's auto combos. The heavy attack can also be used by itself and it knocks your opponent back, letting you hit them with a follow-up. Signature moves are unique to each character and have different properties. For example, you can see Yoruichi throwing knives at Ichigo before going into her light string here. There are also special attacks that deal damage or buff your character depending on who you're playing as, and these can be activated by holding down one of the triggers and pressing a face button. We see Ichigo use two specials in Shikai, one where Old Man Zangetsu buffs him and another where he spins his blade above his head like Hollow Ichigo. He also uses the partial Hollow Mask to get a buff when in Bunkai. As for defense, players have a guard which can be broken if you take too many hits and a flash step to dodge. I think this will be tied to the cross button on PlayStation and A on Xbox. Judging by how Gin wave dashes towards Ichigo like a Mishima trying to end their bloodline. Dodging at the last second also seems to be how you activate that teleport move which puts you behind your opponent. It's something that Bleach loves to do, so it's pretty funny that they turned it into a game mechanic. But it makes me wonder if you'll get into situations like in Sparking where you can just keep teleporting behind each other. Next up are the game's resources. They give you 5 to manage, so it's a lot to take in. There's Reishi, which is your health, Konpaku, which are stocks, Fighting Spirit lets you transform, Spiritual Power is your special meter, and the reverse gauge has several different effects depending on when you use it, kind of like the Roman cancel system in Guilty Gear. To win a match, you need to reduce your opponent's stocks from 9 to 0, but you can't do this just by depleting their health with normal or special attacks. Instead, they can only be reduced by landing your Kikon move, which works like an ultimate attack. If you're familiar with Dissidia, JJK Curse Clash, or hell even PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, then you should have a rough idea of how this works. In these games, you hit your opponent with basic attacks to build up a resource, and then cash it out with a different ability to deal true damage or KO the enemy outright. As far as I know, there isn't really a name for this specific kind of mechanic, but Rebirth of Souls has its own version of this. Let's just call it a damage bank system. And I think this is how it works in Bleach. The number of stocks your Kikon move will take is normally 2, 3, or 4 depending on how much fighting spirit your character has. But if you bring your opponent's health down to 0, which causes a soul break, you'll take an extra stock, but I don't know if this stacks. This seems to be what's reflected with the orange and yellow highlights in the UI. Orange stocks are what your attacks will definitely take, and yellow is the potential extra stocks from a soul break. And of course, with this being an anime fighter, there are transformations and other abilities like the previously mentioned buffs for Ichigo, which also affect the stocks. The fighting spirit meter increases during the battle as you deal and receive damage, and can go up to 3 different stages: Evolution, Sublimation, and Spirit Drive. But for the sake of convenience, let's just call them levels 1, 2, and 3. In your normal or base state, your Kikon move takes 2 stocks, but after going to level 1, you get a new move which takes 3. In the case of Ichigo in the first demonstration match, he took 3 in base because he was buffed by Zangetsu. It looks to me like level 1 is the only stage that lets you transform and change your moveset, which is a pattern we see repeated across the 5 matches shown. Level 2 gives you another new Kikon which increases stock damage by 1 again, and level 3 is just a stat boost of some sort. We see Ichigo use a Shikai Getsuga Tensho in base, a Bunkai Getsuga after level 1, the attack he used against Byakuya in their fight at level 2, which is the same move again in level 3, but there it does more damage, so I think this checks out. Something else that I noticed is if you and your opponents are at different levels, the weaker player is at risk of losing more stocks. Well, that's adorable. This encourages players to transform as soon as they can so they don't play at a disadvantage, which is something that I'm a little worried about, but I'll come back to it in a bit. With the stock system out of the way, as I mentioned before, spiritual power is your basic special meter. Simply hit the opponent to build it up and use your attacks. The reverse gauge on the other hand has 3 applications. Activate it in neutral for boosting your special meter and health. Use it while attacking to also increase special meter and extend your combos. Or use it when taking a hit to break out of your opponent's attacks and recover your guard gauge. All in all, this is definitely more in depth than I expected and seems more complex than most anime fighters, which is a good sign. I think the system has the potential to be very interesting. But now I want you to watch this clip of Yoruichi's kick-on move and tell me if you notice anything interesting.
マジか。基本技が入りました。あ、やば。やったー。
気をつけろよ。この技はまだ。
やばい。あー、やっべ。
Did you see it? And no, I don't mean the Senran Kagura physics doing God's work. Let's keep watching.
さあ一気に夜一のターンが。やばい。じゃちょっと待って、すごいやばいこれ。入る。やばいやばい。ダメだ。入った。やばいやばい。全然避けらんない。本技が。ちょっと待って待って待って。原作書には勝てんのか。
Okay, can you tell me what she used to activate this attack? Her spiritual power stayed the same, she didn't use a reverse action, and the fighting spirit meter is consistent. The answer seems to be nothing. As far as I can tell, a kick-on move doesn't actually use any resources. The player here, also known as Tai Takubo, you know, the creator of Bleach, does it twice within 30 seconds and there isn't anything to suggest that he couldn't have done it more. And this is where my main concern comes from. The first demonstration match between Ichigo and Yoruichi runs for roughly 5 minutes, which is a bit on the longer side for a fighting game, but it's not that bad. Until you realize that including all the kick-on moves and transformations, there are 7 cutscenes at play during this battle. 1 for each of their evolutions, 3 for Ichigo's kick-on moves, and 2 for Yoruichi's, both of which ended up being the same one this time. I timed every transformation shown in the gameplay demo and they all come in at around 10 seconds long. And while that might not sound like a big deal, just keep in mind that this means whenever someone wins as Ichigo, you'll see his Bunkai animation and at least 2 to 3 cinematic attacks in a single match, every match. And there's a good chance that 2 of those will be the same one. You could argue that games like Storm or Sparking do the same thing, or are even longer with the case of Team Ultimate Jutsus, but those can be avoided or interrupted. And most importantly, they aren't a mandatory part of winning a game. The battles in Rebirth of Souls follow a consistent beat that means these cutscenes will play out in every match. This would be like if Tekken 8 had 3 stages of rage instead of 1, and in order to win, you needed to hit your opponent with your rage art multiple times or you can't KO them. So instead of being a matter of if you're going to use it, it becomes a matter of when, removing a layer of strategy and forcing all games to play out the same way. But as I mentioned earlier, I don't think this will be too much of a problem now or even early into the game's lifecycle, but the longer players have the games in their hands, the more of the same cutscenes they'll see, and the more it'll start to wear thin. And while there is some depth to the mechanics, I can see Rebirth of Souls' rigid win condition not only making the game repetitive to play, but more importantly, repetitive to watch. And these days, viewership can play a pretty big role in how successful a fighting game will be in the long run, but maybe I'm wrong about this. At the very least, it seems like Bandai Namco are confident it'll be a success. Development looks pretty far along despite Bandai Nunchuck announcing it a few months ago, and there's a lot of polish in what we've seen so far. The English voice cast has also been showcased ever since the announcement trailer, which makes me think that voice recordings are all done. So I expect the game will be released early next year, and I'll be picking it up day 1 regardless of how it turns out. After all, I've been waiting for a game like this for over 10 years, so if it turns out that the moment-to-moment gameplay is completely unaffected by the cinematics, then that would be a big win. But what are your thoughts? Am I worrying for no reason, or have you noticed this too? Let me know how you're feeling about Bleach Rebirth of Souls so far and which character you want to see in the game. Like if you liked it, subscribe if you're new. This has been Combo Trigger, but until next time, take care.